Afghanistan. Yeah, Afghanistan. Remember that place? Feels like forever ago, doesn't it? Like it's yesterday's news. But hold on, because this story, it's far from over. We're talking about the very real chance, and it has a chance, that Afghanistan becomes a terrorist haven all over again.
Yeah.
And not just any terrorists. We're talking Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, the groups that have a history, a bad one, of targeting the West.
Well, you know what's really, I think, fascinating about this is that Afghanistan has this really long history as a haven for these groups, right?
Right.
But the U.S. withdrawal, that really threw a wrench in things, created a vacuum, a power vacuum. And these groups, well, they're trying to fill it.
Yeah, it's like we yanked the rug out from under the whole region, and now we're seeing the aftershocks.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So to really get a handle on this, what we're doing today is a deep dive into a report from the Council on Foreign Relations. It's called Countering a Resurgent Terrorist Threat in Afghanistan. Now, they actually put out a similar report back in 2020, so this updated version. It gives us, I think, a really good, clear picture of how things have changed, how they've gotten honestly worse since then.
Yeah.
So today we're going to cut through all those headlines. We're going to try to figure out how serious is this threat right now, what's different now than when the U.S. left, and what can be done to stop it, if anything.
Right. And to understand just how urgent this is, you got to look at the situation in Afghanistan right now. I mean, it's really dire.
Yeah.
The Taliban, their rule has just devastated the economy. They don't even control much outside the cities. Basic services, they've just crumbled. And this creates, well, it's like the perfect breeding ground for these terrorist groups.
It's like, I don't know, like fertilizer for extremism, right? You've got all these desperate people, no real government, and groups like Al-Qaeda, well, they're ready to take advantage.
Right.
And get this, the report says that Al-Qaeda may have doubled their numbers in Afghanistan since the U.S. left.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just like a few, low-level guys either. We're talking key leaders.
Okay.
Ayman al-Zawahiri, he's there.
Wow.
And what's even more concerning is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, it's unprecedented.
How so?
Well, Sirajuddin Haqqani, this guy's a U.S. designated terrorist. Okay?
Right.
He's the Taliban's interior minister. This gives Al-Qaeda direct influence on the Afghan government, which they never had before.
So Al-Qaeda's back, big time. But the question I think a lot of people have is, are they planning another 9/11? I mean, should we be worried about a major attack here in the U.S.?
That's a million-dollar question, right? A large-scale attack like 9/11, that's less likely now because security, it's much tighter. But that doesn't mean we're totally in the clear.
Okay.
Al-Qaeda, they could easily inspire, support smaller attacks, maybe in Europe, Africa, even softer targets here.
So, different approach, but still incredibly dangerous. And then there's ISIS-K, kind of the wild card in all of this. Can you explain who they are and how they fit into this mess?
Yeah, so you've got Al-Qaeda kind of rebuilding their network, but then there's ISIS-K. That stands for Islamic State Khorasan Province.
Catchy.
Right. And they're actually enemies of both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They want a caliphate too, but they're much more brutal, much more chaotic. Before the U.S. left, they were kind of on the ropes. Counterterrorism, it had really weakened them.
But I'm guessing the withdrawal, that changed things for them too.
Totally. Just like Al-Qaeda, they've bounced back big time. Numbers have doubled. And a lot of that, it comes from the Taliban releasing thousands of prisoners.
Oh, great.
And get this, almost half of their fighters, they're foreign.
Meaning?
They came to Afghanistan from other countries.
Wow. That's a scary thought. So they clearly have these international ambitions, but what are they actually capable of? Could they pull off something big? And where?
Well, a U.S. attack, a big one like 9/11, that's probably less likely for them.
No.
But they've been really good at inspiring those lone wolf attacks in the West.
Right.
And inside Afghanistan, well, they're already active. Remember the Kabul airport attack during the evacuation?
Oh, yeah.
That was them. Over 180 people killed, including 13 U.S. service members.
A horrific tragedy. So it's not just Al-Qaeda, it's not just ISIS-K. We've got a whole bunch of other groups now operating in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's like a whole buffet of bad guys. You've got groups like Taliban Pakistan, the TTP.
Okay.
They want to overthrow the Pakistani government. They're getting stronger, and Afghanistan, well, it's a safe place for them. And then you've got the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement and a whole bunch of others. I mean, the Taliban victory, it's like it's emboldened jihadists everywhere.
And the report talks about how these groups celebrated online when the Taliban took Kabul. They saw it as this sign of a global jihadist comeback. Al-Qaeda even put out a statement. They called it a, quote, prelude to more victories. So this isn't just an Afghan problem.
Exactly. It's global. A global ideological threat, really.
So we've got this really alarming situation in Afghanistan. The big question is, what can the U.S. do about it? We can't exactly send troops back in.
Right, and that's what makes this so tricky. The report, it lays out two main policy options. Working with the Taliban against ISIS-K, or what they call over-the-horizon counterterrorism.
Working with the Taliban? Are you serious?
It sounds crazy, right?
Yeah, this is the group that sheltered Al-Qaeda before 9/11.
Yeah, but the logic, it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This would mean aid, intelligence sharing, all in exchange for the Taliban going after ISIS-K.
Yeah.
General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he's even said it's possible.
Possible, okay. But I mean, wouldn't this just make the Taliban look legitimate, give them a free pass on everything else they're doing? And let's not forget, they're still buddies with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, you're hitting all the weak points there. It's really unlikely the Taliban's going to just drop Al-Qaeda, even if we help them, and there's no guarantee they'd actually be effective against ISIS-K.
So, option one, shaky at best. What about this over-the-horizon counterterrorism thing? Sounds kind of like, I don't know, a Tom Clancy novel.
Yeah, it's basically drone strikes, special ops raids, all without boots on the ground.
Ah, okay.
Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, he said this has worked in places like Yemen and Somalia.
Hold on. Isn't Afghanistan totally different? I mean, in those places, we had allies on the ground, intelligence, bases nearby. We don't have any of that in Afghanistan right now.
That's exactly right. You've hit on the big problem with this approach in Afghanistan. We've got almost no intelligence network left, no partner forces, no bases close by.
And remember that drone strike in Kabul, the one that killed all those civilians?
Yeah.
That was supposed to be us showing off our over-the-horizon skills.
It really highlights, I think, the huge blind spots we have.
Right.
Relying on over-the-horizon stuff alone, it's super risky, could easily lead to more civilian deaths.
So if neither of these options are great, what does the report actually recommend?
Well, they call for a three-part plan.
Ooh, 3 parts. I'm intrigued.
All right, so first, rebuild the intelligence network. That means working with locals, both inside and outside Afghanistan, to get information on these terrorist groups. Think of it like a covert op, something the CIA might do.
So spies. I like it. But who are we going to work with?
Well, there are some potential allies out there. Ahmad Massoud, he leads the National Resistance Front. Amrullah Saleh, the former vice president.
Okay.
We could also try to work with some of the anti-Taliban tribes.
Yeah.
The FIA's got a long history of this kind of stuff, so it's not impossible.
Right, so that's step 1. What's next?
Number 2, we need to get those bases back.
Yeah.
Or at least access to them. We got to negotiate with the neighbors, even if it's just for surveillance flights.
It's easier said than done, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, maybe even India. And then there's Russia.
Right, they probably won't love that.
No, they see Central Asia as their turf. They will not be happy about us being there. So yeah, this is going to be tough.
So we might have to sweeten the deal a bit. Economic aid, security guarantees, who knows? Going to take some serious diplomacy. But even if we get those bases, even if we rebuild our intel, what about actually taking action? How do we do this over-the-horizon thing without making the same mistakes, without killing more civilians?
Well, that's the hardest part. Drone strikes, they're inherently risky. You got to have really, really good intel, and even then, there's always a chance of collateral damage.
And we have to be honest about what this approach can and can't do. It's not going to wipe out terrorism completely.
Nope. It's one tool in a big toolbox, and we've got to be very, very careful how we use it.
So for our listeners, the people at home, why should they care about all this? Why does Afghanistan matter to them?
Because it's not just some far-off problem that doesn't affect us here. These groups in Afghanistan, they have global goals. They want to attack the West. They want to spread their ideology. And now they've got a safe place to plan, to train.
And we've seen how fast things can change. I mean, the Taliban took over in just a few weeks. No one saw it coming.
All right, so we can't afford to be complacent. We got to be aware. We got to hold our leaders accountable for the choices they make.
So this is a call to action for everyone listening. Don't just tune this out because Afghanistan feels like old news. This is a story that's still being written, and it could impact every single one of us.
We need to stay informed, stay involved, and be vigilant. This is a global problem, and it demands a global response.
And speaking of staying informed, this deep dive, this is just the beginning. The report from the Council on Foreign Relations, it goes into a lot more detail, and we encourage you to check it out. You can find it on their website.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, but it's one that we all need to understand. Because the choices we make today, they're going to have consequences for years to come.
We've talked about the threat, the options, the challenges, but there's this one question that I keep coming back to. What if we do nothing? What if we just sit back and watch while Afghanistan falls apart?
That's a scary thought, really. And honestly, it's not a matter of if, it's when something big happens. If we ignore this problem, it's only going to get worse. We'll see more terrorism, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world.
So doing nothing is not a choice. We have to act. We have to be decisive. But even with good intentions, there's no guarantee we'll succeed.
That's the tough reality. This is a long game, and it's complicated. There will be setbacks. But we can't let fear or uncertainty paralyze us.
We have to learn from what went wrong. We have to adapt, and we got to work together.
Yeah, the stakes are just too high to ignore. The future of Afghanistan, maybe even the world, it's hanging in the balance.
That's a pretty heavy note to end on.
It's true, though, No sugarcoating it. This is serious.
And it's something we'll keep talking about here on the deep dive. But for now, I want to turn it over to you, our listener. What's the one thing that's really stuck with you from all of this?
Yeah, what stood out? Well, I'm not a policymaker or anything. But if I were, I think I'd have to start by saying, we messed up the withdrawal.
It was chaotic, it was poorly planned, and now we're seeing what happens when you do that.
It's easy to point fingers.
Yeah.
But we got to focus on what we do now. What can we actually DO about this threat?
Well, the report's recommendations, they give us a starting point for sure. Rebuilding that intelligence network, that's going to be priority number one.
Mm-hmm.
We need to know what's going on. Who are the players? What are they planning?
Right. And we talked about maybe working with some pretty unsavory characters to get that intel.
Yeah.
How do we balance that need with, our morals and the risk of making those groups stronger?
Yeah, that's the tough part, isn't it? It's this balancing act. And there are no easy answers. We've got to be really careful who we work with, what kind of support we give them. It can't be a blank check,
We can't just throw money and weapons at the problem and hope for the best.
Right.
There needs to be some serious oversight, some accountability. What about those bases in the neighboring countries? How realistic is it that they'll let us operate there? It's going to be tough to convince them. They've got their own interests, their own worries.
Yeah.
They might worry about making the Taliban mad or becoming targets themselves.
Right.
And don't forget, Russia. They see Central Asia as their backyard. They won't be happy about any U.S. military presence there.
So we might have to offer them something pretty good to get them on board. Maybe economic aid security guarantees. I don't know. It's going to take some serious diplomacy. But even if we get those bases, even if we rebuild the intelligence, what about the strikes themselves? How do we actually do this over-the-horizon counterterrorism without, making the same mistakes and killing more civilians?
That is the million-dollar question. Drone strikes, they're just inherently risky. We need to have rock-solid intelligence, and even then, there's always a chance of collateral damage.
We can't pretend this approach is a cure-all.
No.
It's not going to get rid of terrorism completely.
Absolutely not. It's one tool in a big toolbox, and we need to use it carefully, strategically.
So for our listeners out there, why should they care about what's happening in Afghanistan?
Because this isn't some faraway problem that has nothing to do with us. These groups, they have global ambitions. They want to attack the West. They want to spread their ideology. And now they have a safe haven to do it from.
And we've seen how quickly things can change. The Taliban took over in, a few weeks? Nobody predicted that?
Exactly. We can't afford to be complacent. We have to be aware of the threat, and we have to hold our leaders accountable for the decisions they make.
So this is a call to action for everyone listening. Don't tune this out just because Afghanistan seems like old news. This is a story that's still unfolding, and it could affect all of us.
We need to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay vigilant. This is a global challenge that requires a global response.
And speaking of staying informed, this deep dive is just the tip of the iceberg. The report from the Council on Foreign Relations has a ton of great information, and we really encourage you to check it out. You can find it on their website.
It's a complicated issue for sure, but it's one that we all need to understand, because the choices we make today will have consequences for years to come.
We've talked about the threat, the options, the challenges, but there's one question that's been in the back of my mind this whole time. What if we do nothing? What if we just sit back and watch Afghanistan fall apart?
That's a scary thought, honestly.
Yeah.
And it's not a question of if, but when something major happens. If we ignore this problem, it's only going to get worse. We'll see a resurgence of terrorist activity, not just in Afghanistan, but around the world.
So doing nothing is not an option. We have to act, and we have to act decisively. But even with the best intentions, there are no guarantees of success.
That's the hard truth. This is a long game, a complicated game, and there will be setbacks along the way. But we can't let fear or uncertainty paralyze us.
We have to learn from the mistakes we made, adapt to the changing realities on the ground, and work together to find solutions.
Because the stakes are just too high to ignore. The future of Afghanistan and maybe even the world hangs in the balance.
That's a pretty heavy note to end on.
It's true, though. There's no sugarcoating this. This is a serious issue that needs our attention.
And it's one that we'll keep following here on the Deep Dive. But for now, I want to bring it back to you, our listener. What's the one thing that has stood out to you in all of this?
For me, it's just how complicated it all is.
Yeah.
You've got so many different players, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, all these countries trying to get involved. And then the global impact, right? It's like this giant tangled mess. And there's no easy answer. No easy answer. No quick fix that's going to solve everything.
Right.
This needs a really smart response, and you got to understand all the pieces,
Totally. I think it's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the sound bites, but the reality is much messier. It's always changing, too.
Exactly. What we think is true today might be completely different tomorrow.
Right.
That's why we got to stay informed, keep learning, and always question what we think we know.
We can't just sit back and think we've got it all figured out. We've got to keep thinking critically and having these tough conversations.
Yeah, and remember the human cost, too. All this is happening to real people. The people of Afghanistan are caught in the middle, and they deserve our support.
This isn't just some game, like countries moving pieces around a board. We're talking about real lives, real families, real communities being torn apart by all of this.
Absolutely.
We can't forget that.
We got to keep that in mind as we try to figure this all out.
So as we move forward, let's try to use both our heads and our hearts.
I like that.
Yeah. We got to understand the facts, but also remember that our decisions affect real people.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Yeah, I hope this has helped, our listeners understand this whole situation a little better.
Yeah.
The threat, the options, the challenges. It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But understanding what's really going on, that's the first step to finding solutions.
Exactly. We've laid out the facts, explored the options, talked about the dangers. But now we want to leave you with a question. What would you do? If you were in charge, what would your strategy be? There's no right answer, but it's something to think about. We encourage you to keep learning, do your own research, and talk about this with other people.
Yeah, because this is a challenge that affects us all.
The decisions made in response to this threat, they will shape the future of Afghanistan and have ripple effects across the globe.
That's the truth.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the terrorist threat in Afghanistan. It's a complex situation that's constantly changing, but it's one that we all need to pay attention to. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.